His friend bought it, gave it to him at this high school dance in Australia. And the kid thought he could fly and jumped off a balcony and landed kind of an iron fence and impaled himself, essentially, and died.
Nearly a decade ago, Ross Ulbricht, the founder of the Silk Road dark web marketplace, was sentenced to a double life sentence in prison. Once known as the outlaw mastermind behind one of the web's earliest illicit marketplaces, Ross amassed millions of dollars in cryptocurrency before most people had ever even heard of Bitcoin. Now he's out of prison and has transformed himself into a powerful influencer and burgeoning political figure in the MAGA movement. Ryan Mack at the New York Times has been covering Ross for over a decade, from when his Silk Road saga was just beginning. Today, we're going to dive deep into Ross's life, talk about how the Silk Road transformed the web, and how this crazy alliance between Bitcoin billionaires, libertarians, and MAGA diehards has skyrocketed Ross Ulbricht to fame and set him up for a major role in U.S. politics. Hi, Ryan. Welcome to my podcast.
What's up? How's it going?
Okay, so I want to dig into the Silk Road. Ross Ulbricht, you wrote this amazing story kind of detailing his comeback. A lot of people, I think, aren't familiar what he's been up to recently, but I want to start from the beginning. Can you talk about the Silk Road and what it was for people who don't remember? Where did this website come from and what did it do?
Yeah, it's crazy because it's been so long. I mean, I started reporting on this story when Ulbricht was arrested in 2013, as a kind of a cub reporter starting my career, and to think back and look back on it is kind of crazy. But the Silk Road, for those who weren't around at that time or don't remember it, was a dark web marketplace to buy drugs. You could do a lot of other things on it too, buy other things, but mainly it was drugs. So anything from heroin to methamphetamine to pot to, you name it, you could probably find it on that website. And you use Tor to access the dark web. Tor is a anonymizing online software that kind of routes your internet traffic through different places so you can't be tracked. And you use it to access the Silk Road on the dark web. And from there, you kind of just could browse anything like it was the Amazon of drugs, basically.
The Silk Road is the first time I remember, and I was also just getting started in journalism, but hearing about the dark web. And I feel like people, especially as tech reporters, would always kind of normie people would ask you about it. I never even knew how to access it. What was being sold? I knew people that got fake IDs off there and obviously the drug stuff, but what was actually going on that website? Was it all just complete illegal debauchery, or was there some reason for it to exist other than that?
When we say the dark web, first of all, it means an unindexed part of the internet. A lot of the stuff we see on Google is stuff that's indexable, it's findable, it's searchable. The dark web is not that. It's everything else, basically. You use Tor to access it. But yeah, in terms of the Silk Road and what it sold, yes, there were a lot of drugs, but there was art. There was knickknacks. There was fake IDs as well. There was some limitations on what could be bought and sold there. For example, child porn, for example, was ruled out. I think weapons at some point were ruled out. I have to double check that. But it wasn't a complete free-for-all. There were some limitations. But there were also a lot of dangerous things on there. There was one discussion about selling chemicals that could, assist in side, basically. That was sellable on Silk Road. So yeah, it was kind of a wild west in terms of a place where things were bought and sold.
Well, also, you had to use Bitcoin or crypto, right? You couldn't just put your credit card info even back then, obviously. So how much of the dark road's kind of early success was tied in with the crypto industry back then?
So Silk Road, was one of the first sites or first places to kind of mainstream Bitcoin. There wasn't you could, again, enter in your Visa credit card number and have a payment processor take down your information so you could buy heroin. You needed something to also be anonymous for payments. And Bitcoin provided that. It was this up and coming digital cryptocurrency. A lot of people didn't know about it, or they saw it as kind of a speculative thing. But in this case, there was a real use case in terms of anonymizing online buyers and preventing your payments from being tracked, essentially. So you would put your Bitcoin into an account on the site. You would buy your drugs. The money would go into an escrow account as the drugs were being shipped. And so they were literally shipped through regular mail. The drugs would arrive on your doorstep, and then the money would be released to the seller. And you would use the product. You would rate it after that. Was it good? Is it bad? And in a way that you would rate an Amazon package. It was kind of, in some ways, ingenious in that way.
Yeah. And in some ways, it sounds safer even, or more regulated almost, not top down, but more streamlined rather than just buying drugs off the street.
In some ways, and that was the argument that the Silk Road's creator made. And the Silk Road's creator was named the Dread Pirate Roberts. That was his online name. And his argument was a very libertarian one, which is that if you rate what you're getting, you can maybe tell other people how it is and make it safer. I think there's a lot of holes to that argument as well. What happens if you're the first person to use something from a first-time seller and you die or you get horribly injured, which happened in some cases to people who use Silk Road. But that was kind of the libertarian argument to it, yeah, for sure.
You mentioned Dread Pirate Roberts, who I think you said is a character in The Princess Bride and is this sort of like pseudonymous owner of the website. How long did Silk Road exist before it was shut down? And what happened? Like, when did Ross Ulbricht get discovered and what was that process like?
So I believe it was online for about 2-ish years before it was shut down. It was shut down in October.
That's so short.
Yeah, it was a short time, but it went pretty far. And I remember the thing that really blew it up was Adrian Chen at Gawker wrote one of the first stories on it. And he said, this is a place where people buy and sell drugs online. Eventually Chuck Schumer found it and made a big stink out of it, as any, I feel like, reasonable lawmaker would, because it's illegal, essentially. And I think that story was 2011. At the time I was at Forbes, I was starting my career, and my colleague Andy Greenberg actually was one of the first people to interview the Dread Pirate Roberts. We ran this kind of anonymized interview with the creator of Silk Road at the time. And so we were kind of, along with Gawker, at the forefront of reporting on this. And it was like very interesting to see. At one point, Andy did this experiment where he actually bought weed off the Silk Road. And there was a video online somewhere of like Forbes reporters buying weed and then eventually flushing it down the toilet. But the whole thing worked.
Flushing it down the toilet.
Yeah, sure. There's actually footage of it being flushed on the toilet. But, it worked. And it was pretty stunning in the simplicity and the effectiveness. And, just as we were doing it, I realized federal agents were doing that. And they were trying to figure out how this whole thing was working and trying to figure out who was behind this thing.
So when did it all come to a head? When did the federal agents discover that it was Ross, and how did they piece that together?
I've talked to some agents and folks that worked on the prosecution in this story, but they also saw the Gawker story in 2011, and that's when they started to catch on to this thing. And they were also buying drugs and trying to trace them back to the sellers and then arresting the sellers and trying to figure out how they were connected to Silk Road. And it was a very long investigation, long process that initially wasn't taken very seriously by the federal government until they realized the volume of drugs that were being passed through the site. But eventually, things caught up with Silk Road, and on October 1st, I think 2013, which was a crazy date because I think that was the week of the Breaking Bad series finale, which is this tale about a drug dealer, and then you get kind of a real life version of that a week later. And so he's arrested in a San Francisco library. Federal agents kind of surround him as he's working on his computer, logged into Silk Road, and they had this whole planned sting, and then they arrest him there. And that's when he goes into custody.
Wow. So he's arrested over a decade ago. The website shuts down, or the platform, and then he's just in federal prison. Does he start talking to anyone, or is he silent? Does he try to defend himself, or does he just plead guilty?
So the trial begins in, I think, 2015, and he gets sentenced in 2015 to 2 life sentences with no possibility of parole because it's a federal sentence. And at the trial, they reveal all these things. There was discussion about murders for hire, for example, that became quite a big talking point in the story of Ross Ulbricht. There were also stories of people who lost family members because they used drugs off Silk Road. And so he gets sentenced to 2 life sentences in the Southern District of New York. And I kind of think that's the end of his story, that we'll never hear about this guy again.
I want to dig back into the comment you just made on the murder for hire. Could you do murder for hire on the Silk Road and the dark web? And did he do that?
I don't think you could. I have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure you could not hire murders on the Silk Road. But he, outside of Silk Road, or someone, attempted to hire hitmen to go after people who threatened the existence of Silk Road, threatened revealing information or blackmailing him. That information is pretty clear and revealed in these chat logs that have been entered in discovery for the case. Ulbricht, in his defense, has always denied that he tried to do those murders for hire. He said he wasn't running the site at the time. And there's a big part of this whole story, which is that there were several federal agents involved who were actually in some ways corrupt, and they had kind of entrapped him in a way, but were also extracting Bitcoin from the site and trying to extract bribes.
Okay, so first of all, they have him on the chat logs as Dread Pirate Roberts, whatever, allegedly seeking hitmen. And then these federal agents were running a Bitcoin scheme. Like,
there were two agents that were corrupt and involved in the investigation out of, I think, the Baltimore office of the FBI. So their story is also intertwined with this because they also get prosecuted and sent to prison for essentially trying to scam the owner of Silk Road.
So they were trying to scam Bitcoin out of him.
Yeah, essentially, and enrich themselves. Interestingly enough, the murder for hire charges, Ulbricht was never tried for them. There was a separate case where he was charged with it. He was never tried on that charge. And so a lot of Ulbricht supporters believe that the murders for hire are essentially trumped up against him. And they were used to kind of sully his reputation and build a case against him. But I think there's a lot more nuance there. And I think if you look at the chat logs, someone who was running the Dread Pirate Roberts account certainly did order up hits, whether he believed them to have happened or not. He was looking to enact them.
I get why his supporters would say that, but also, like, if you've got the receipts where it's his username asking for the murder for hire, seems not great.
And I should be clear here that Ulbricht's, one of his main defenses is that he did create Silk Road, but he was not running it at the time when it took off and when these alleged
So the other
murders
person
for
could
hires.
have been. Got it.
There was another guy. Yeah.
And is that guy in prison?
Well, that's their allegation. I mean, it's never.
It's never
said,
okay. This guy has never sort of come to fruition. Okay. So this is 2015 when he gets sentenced. I feel like that's such a pivotal year. Really, 2016 is when so much changed in culture. I mean, like you mentioned,
what happened that year?
Some of the support with libertarians, but we have 2016, Donald Trump, and this kind of like, I feel like, they call themselves libertarians, but it's sort of this like crypto libertarian types of people that are so against the federal government. They sort of want, maximum freedom online, some of which I support. But what happened when he was sentenced? Like, did those people sort of come out immediately in support of him? What role did that sort of burgeoning crypto movement play?
I don't think you could have created an individual who would have been like more sympathetic to people that mistrust the government than Ross Ulbricht. A big part of his history was that he was a libertarian in college and, grew up in this kind of Randian kind of way and, became deeply affected and influenced by libertarian thought. You wrap in the crypto element as well of these crypto supporters who already distrust government, and that's why they believe in Bitcoin. And so you get these two groups of people, the libertarians and the crypto supporters, who become this very big support base for Ross Ulbricht, almost from the get-go. As soon as the trial is going, you have these large groups of supporters. Someone who is very, very influential in this whole process is his mom, Lynn Ulbricht, who dedicates her life to basically rescuing her son and goes out and does all these speeches and meetings and essentially lobbying with these groups, trying to get them involved with her son's cause of Free Ross and trying to just keep him in the spotlight. And so, yeah, those two groups kind of coalesce behind him, around him, and become this very big support base, which he builds on throughout the years. And over the decade, even though he is in jail, he has this big support group.
You mentioned his mom. What's his background? Like, how did he sort of come to this point of even founding Silk Road, and what role did his family play? I mean,
Ulbricht is a very interesting character. He grew up in Texas, very smart by all accounts. He went to grad school at Penn State. I think he majored in physics and studying economics as well, and known as a smart guy, someone who is technologically savvy as well. And by all accounts, grew up in a pretty loving household. His mom was very influential. His dad was there, but a loving household. Around the time of Silk Road, his goal was to create something impactful, something that he would be remembered by. You gotta remember this time, there's a lot of startups popping up. We're just past like the social media boom. And so he's thinking about building something for the internet and of the internet. And that's kind of how he lands on Silk Road and starts to cobbling this thing together. I believe he grows his own mushrooms to sell on the site. Those are some of the first products that are sold on the site. And then the thing just takes off. It has all the elements, being secretive a little bit, working well, and it becomes global. You get MDMA distributors from the Netherlands selling, you get heroin distributors. It just becomes this kind of big thing that eventually kind of grows out of his control. Okay, so he's sentenced 2015. There's this burgeoning crypto libertarian movement that's behind him. Trump comes into office. Trump won his first term. How did he get on Trump's radar? Like, was he on his radar back then? And like, what was his life like during that first
Trump presidency?
I would say not at all, not on Trump's radar at all. And you got to remember that Trump's message coming in, be hard on crime, hard on immigrants who are bringing in drugs to our country. In some ways, Trump's message was completely antithetical to Ulbricht's cause, right? Like, if you're going to be hard on drugs and hard on criminals, someone like Ulbricht should be in prison in the Trump reasoning of 2016. And so what happens during that period is he's not on Trump's radar at all. But Lynn Ulbricht starts networking with people that can get her a meeting with the administration. And the thinking there was he was going through the appeals process. It wasn't looking pretty for him. So the only way he could get out was through some kind of pardon. And the person in power that could do that was Donald Trump. And so Lynn Ulbricht actually starts networking with a lot of kind of far-right, alt-right influencers at the time. I remember being in DC at a completely different hearing, something for social media, like I think Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey and Facebook CEO Sheryl Sandberg were testifying on the Hill. And I turn around and I see Lynn Ulbricht sitting next to some alt-right folks. And I'm like, how are they connected? It's very strange. And it took me a couple years to realize that she was building a support base, of folks that could get her closer to Trump or to people around Trump, that she could build a case for her son.
It's kind of interesting the way these mothers come out in support of their kids. I don't know. I was just thinking of Sam Bankman-Fried's mother as well, or just some other parents of people that have been charged in various crimes. Okay, so he's sort of sitting away in prison. His mom is out there meeting with all of these right-wing influencers, trying to kind of get on their radar. Is he speaking to anyone? Is he saying anything? You mentioned his appeals case was kind of going nowhere, but I think you mentioned in your story too that he started talking to a girlfriend, or I don't know if that was later.
Yeah, there were definitely media outlets, myself included, that tried to get in touch with him to very little success. And I think that was to his mom's credit of distancing himself from media folks. But he was, in our reporting in this story, we found out he was responding to people. And one of the people he responded to was this French woman who was working at some tech companies in California. Her name was Caroline Debrion. And she just wrote him letters. She became fascinated by his case and just started asking questions via written letter. And he would respond. And they struck up a friendship and then eventually kind of a romance, even though he was in prison, to the point where he's sitting in jail. She ends up becoming involved in the Free Ross cause. And they get engaged. I guess there were some people that were getting to him, and he was getting his message out through, his mom and this Twitter account she ran as well.
So what was the Free Ross message and movement? What was his kind of case that he was making for his freedom?
The Free Ross argument was essentially, there was a couple pillars. One, that he should not have received 2 life sentences.
It does seem kind of excessive.
There was a big argument to that, and I think even some of the prosecutors were surprised by the amount of time he received. But you got to remember, there were people that died from using this thing, and people got hurt. And I think the judge wanted to set an example. But the Free Ross message was that the example that was set was way too harsh, that Ross simply created the site. He didn't sell or distribute the drugs himself. And they continued with this kind of suggestion that he wasn't even running it at the time that it grew and these supposed murders for hire happened, that it was potentially someone else. And so his mother, to his credit, continued to hammer home this message. There was a Twitter account, she had a website, she did a lot of speeches. I would hope my mom would do the same if I was in jail, I guess. And she was relentless in this. It became a movement, a Free Ross movement, to the point where there were shirts, and the libertarians made this kind of their number one cause going into 2024.
Yeah, so I want to kind of zoom forward a little bit to, of course, Trump loses in 2020, has this resurgence. When did this cause start to get back on Trump's radar, and who kind of brought it into his realm?
So by the end of 2020, there was a drafted pardon or a commutation of Ulbricht's sentence, or some version of that got to Trump's desk. And Ulbricht's mom's efforts had largely worked. It got to the person who had the power to erase this sentence and get him out. And what happened is January 6th, and there were some elements within the Trump administration who felt like pardoning Ross Ulbricht or commuting a sentence would send the wrong message. And so Trump's last day in office came and went. There There was sort of hope that would happen, but eventually it didn't. And when Biden came into office, there was simply no chance. They had no relationships with the Democrats. I don't think it was in Biden's interest at all in pardoning Ross Ulbricht. And so they kind of lost all hope by that point, or lost a lot of hope.
When did things change? I mean, so that's the end of Trump's first presidency. He announces he's going to run again, 2020, when was that? 2023, 2022. How did he get back on the radar? Like, was this something that was like in Trump's mind, or was this something pushed by the libertarians?
So his mom continues after 2020 to push for Ross's freedom. And I think what an interesting decision that was made by Ross and Caroline at the time, was to participate in this documentary. There's a documentary filmmaker that approached them, and he starts to do these jailhouse interviews with this guy, Blake Harris, with the idea of doing a documentary that might change public opinion. You got to remember at the time, there was no pardon on the table. Maybe their best shot was putting out some kind of media or participating in some kind of media that might sway public opinion and make him a more sympathetic figure. And so he starts to do about hours and hours of jailhouse calls with Blake Harris. And that begins, I think, in just around the pandemic time or shortly after.
And who's Blake Harris? Like, is he some libertarian guy that's sympathetic to the cause? Like, how did he get hooked up in all of this?
Blake's a filmmaker. He's someone I talk to a lot for this piece because he comes up again later in the narrative, but he's just a filmmaker and an author as well.
Ross just decided to trust him?
Yeah. I mean, it's quite strange. Blake, I think, had written a book about Palmer Luckey, the founder of Oculus and founder of Anduril now. And I think Ross read that in prison or something and thought that the portrayal was good and decided to trust Blake, who, to his credit, was very forthright and relentless in trying to get him to talk because he saw this as a great opportunity to make a film. And so, as any reporter would, or any person working to get a story would, he kind of works his source and eventually gets him to a point where he trusts him and starts talking to him for hours at a time.
Where does that end up going, and what year are we in now? Like, because he's just doing all these interviews, which, by the way, seems like a huge liability. But I get the mentality of like, what else do we have to lose? Might as well get my story out. But how does this progress as we get closer and closer to the 24 election?
So these interviews keep happening, I think, throughout 2022, 2023, and 24. And Ross is continuing to work on, to talk to Blake and tell his story. But at the same time, in late 2023, Trump is kind of ramping up his campaign. And he's looking for votes. And one of the places he goes to for those votes is the Libertarian Party. He sets up a meeting with Angela McArdle, the head of the Libertarian Party at the time, and asks, like, what is your one demand? What does the Libertarian Party want from me if I were to get the presidency? And their number one concern was the freeing of Ross Ulbricht. And so Angela McArdle tells him, if you free Ross Ulbricht, then you'll get our votes. Just promise that. And so Trump then goes to the Libertarian National Convention and says in a speech, I will free Ross Ulbricht on day one. I'll commute his sentence if you vote for me. And that became his promise. He repeated it again at another crypto conference later that year, and we're now in 2024. And it became kind of this weird campaign promise that really wasn't linked to anything else on his platform besides, essentially it was a deal. It was favor trading. And yeah, the libertarians got what they wanted.
All right. So the libertarians have taken this up as their cause. Trump's like, I got you. We're going to pardon him. Comes into office, pardons him, I believe, on day 2. What happened next? I mean, did they just let Ross walk free? And what did he do with his life? Like, where did he go?
Yeah, so day 2, so not quite the same promise he made, although he did exceed it because he said he was going to commute the sentence, which, just erases the time and, puts it to time served. But he issues a full pardon. So erases this from his record, full stop. And Ross walks out of prison, his Arizona federal prison, with his backpack, his gray jumpsuit, and this plant that he's carrying from his cell. I'm sure it's a surreal feeling, but someone who thought they would spend their whole life behind bars is now suddenly free and free to do whatever they want because there's nothing holding them back, right? And at that time, my colleague David Yaffe-Bellany, who worked on the story with me, we wrote the story about the pardon and how it came together. But we were thinking like, man, this guy's going to have some weird shit happen to him. There's like a lot of things that are going to happen to him because he's re-entering society after a decade behind bars. He's a cult hero in some of these communities. What is he going to do next? And so we spent the kind of last 6 months following him. And I don't know what you would do if you were 40 years old and in prison for 11, 12 years and then rejoining society.
Well, also, I mean, he doesn't have any money, right? Like he's just coming out of jail. And then, so like, he wasn't allowed to keep any of that Silk Road money, right? So, I mean, do people start donating to him or what happens?
The government sees most of the Silk Road Bitcoin or all of it, as far as I'm aware, and he no longer has access to it. At some point, he was like struggling for cash to the point where he starts auctioning off some of his possessions from jail for money. A couple months out of jail, though, he receives a 31 million-ish donation in Bitcoin from this unknown account, which people have now, researchers have found that it's linked to another defunct drug site called Alphabet. So, now he is wealthier than probably you and I. He has these opportunities in front of him. He's been doing these speeches. He's been giving talks. He went to the Bitcoin conference in May and spoke in front of like this cheering crowd. He's had job opportunities from the crypto industry because, he is a hero to that community. He is one of the Bitcoin OGs.
I mean, $30 million seems like he doesn't have to work, but he's become this figure. Like, what is his current life like, if you can describe it?
So he didn't participate in the story, unfortunately, didn't talk to us. But as far as we understand it, I think he's moved out of Arizona and is now doing speaking engagements. These speaking gigs, by the way, are very interesting because they feel like a political campaign. He went and spoke at the Turning Points USA conference in Tampa, the student conference, and gave a very kind of rah-rah speech initially about Trump and the Republican Party, but then kind of veers into why drug laws are bad. And, he's talked about prison reform, and in some ways is like a politician doing these, testing out these various stump speeches. It's very interesting. Most of these speeches are 20, 25 minutes long, then he walks off stage to cheers. Very controlled environment. He's also been posting Instagrams with his wife on this shared account that he has.
I'm obsessed with this shared Instagram account.
We all have shared Instagram accounts with our loved ones. But yeah, this one's interesting because it's very controlled, and it's I'm in a loving relationship with my wife and we are at the Grand Canyon and we're swimming now, and everything is like a celebration of his freedom.
Does he want to potentially run for political office or play a bigger role, do you think, in our political system? Because it seems like he's also, he's amassed enormous power as an influencer and as the face of this cause. But just given how intertwined he is with the political movement that ultimately got him freed, do you see a future in which he runs for office?
I do, but I have no evidence of him doing it. You mentioned this idea of him potentially becoming an influencer. I feel like he's right at the beginning of that. He hasn't realized that he can become the face of whatever shitcoin, and get paid millions of dollars for it. But he is right at that point, where there are plenty of people willing to sponsor him and use him as a face because he means everything to that community, to that demographic of crypto users and libertarians, and I guess now Trumpers. He is indebted to Donald Trump, and at every speech he kind of gives this impassioned, this man saved me kind of spiel.
It seems like the crypto world is also so intertwined with Trump still. And I'm curious kind of what that relationship has been like. Obviously, we have David Sachs as the crypto czar. I think he's still there. Well, he was at that dinner recently, so he's definitely still there. But what is the libertarian sort of crypto people's relationship with Trump? Is it strengthening? Is Trump still all in on crypto? I feel like he's used it a lot to enrich himself financially, but what is their end game?
They see him as the most crypto-friendly president of all time. He is someone that has deregulated the industry. He has got rid of a lot of the regulators and overseers at places like the SEC and the CFTC. And he's made it so that these things can flourish, I guess, and be pushed and not regulated, essentially. And yeah, the Trump family has personally benefited in the tunes of hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars from this, Trump coin scheme and all these other crypto initiatives. So the crypto industry in some ways loves it. And if you view Ross Ulbricht through that lens, it's a very smart move because it ties him further to that industry. He's known as the president who saved their hero. And who wouldn't embrace that?
Some of when I read your story made me feel sympathetic to Ross because it's he's this young guy. He makes this website. Yes, it's facilitating a lot of bad things, but isn't that also just true of every single one of these Silicon Valley companies and billionaires? Haven't they all created products that lead to death and harm and horrible things in various ways? And he ends up with 2 life sentences, and it seems like the rest of Silicon Valley and all these other young guys that have, wrought so much harm on our world, haven't been held accountable at all.
Well, I am very familiar with the people you talk about because I report on them every day. But at the end of the day, Ross Ulbricht did something that was highly illegal and knew that he was doing something highly illegal. It's not illegal for Mark Zuckerberg to create a social media site that sucks everyone's time and attention to the point where you go down rabbit holes and believe in conspiracy theories. That, as far as I know, isn't against the law. But it is against the law to distribute heroin and take money for heroin. That's just how our society is built. I don't know if that connection is fair, but Ross Ulbricht did something that was highly illegal and was prosecuted as such. And when you talk to the people who were harmed by the site, I talked to this guy, Rodney Bridge, whose son took this LSD kind of derivative product that was made out of China and sold on the Silk Road. His friend bought it, gave it to him at this high school dance in Australia. And the kid thought he could fly and jumped off a balcony and landed kind of an iron fence and impaled himself essentially and died. Those are the people that get harmed by this stuff. And I think about like negative externalities of not just Silk Road, but when I report on Facebook or Twitter, and when you talk to those people, you can really see pain, and I sympathize with that. So yeah, I'm not someone who's gonna like judge a sentence and think it's like too harsh or too easy, but like that's what Ross got.
The Silk Road shut down, and now we have just the internet sort of explosion throughout the 2010s, almost like after he kind of went away. It seems like there's this move towards this more decentralized internet with crypto and just less accountability. Also, have there been Silk Road copycats?
As soon as Silk Road 1 went down, there was a site called Silk Road 2.0 that came up. There's definitely been some that have been arrested and sites that have been shut down. I think this will continue. It's just something that will exist, and people will hop onto the next thing and the next thing. It'll be a kind of game of whack-a-mole. But in some ways, Ross Ulbricht was the first and the OG and the guy that popularized it. So he'll always be remembered in that way.
Okay, so Ross is a free man. Whatever happened to that documentary?
So Ross, interestingly, has been trying to kill it and is very fearful of it, to the point where he offered $1.77 million to buy it so it wouldn't see the light of day. And I've heard, audio recordings and seen tape. And basically the answer, or the reason why he wants to do that, is because he thinks he's said too much on these tapes. There's 80 hours of it for this filmmaker. I guess he believes he implicated himself in some ways, or is worried about what's going to be made into a film, which is kind of ironic given that he was the one that participated in the first place.
Well, and wasn't it supposed to be like a positive film meant to like help his PR?
I think that was the thinking behind it, something that would make him more sympathetic. But the whole point of doing that was to change public opinion so you could lobby for release. And if you're already released, it means nothing to you anymore.
Now it's just a liability.
Right, it's a liability. And it gets in the way of potential earning opportunities. He wants to write a memoir. Maybe he wants to make his own movie. And if his memoir doesn't match up with what's in the movie, people are going to ask questions. It's very interesting and says a lot about a guy, who wants to control his story. And it makes me think about the speeches that he's giving now. And he loves talking about creating Silk Road. He loves talking about being in prison. But there's kind of that gap where he doesn't talk about in the middle. And because it's the stuff that I think makes him most uncomfortable. And it's probably the reason why he doesn't want to talk to a journalist, because those journalists are going to ask him those very questions. Did you run Silk Road in the era, in 2012, 2013, when it got very popular? Did you order up those murders for hire? And I think those questions get to very uncomfortable places for him. And that's why he's been very controlled in his appearances.
So the documentary filmmaker did not take the $1.77 million.
He did not. He thought he'd be compromising his ethics to sell his film back to his subject, but he did counter with something like a $10 million. He's like, if you give me $10 million, maybe I'll think about it. And I think that kind of cut off negotiations at that point. And so as far as I know, the documentary is still kind of full steam ahead. They're talking to distributors. Now it has a different ending because Trump pardoned him, which kind of changes the film's trajectory. And yeah, I think it's in the works. So
has a streamer bought it or anything?
I think there's conversations right now. So I think eventually they'll get to that point.
All right, Ryan. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's it for the show. You can get bonus episodes of Power User on my Patreon. Don't forget to subscribe to my tech and online culture newsletter, usermag.co. That's usermag.co, where I write about all of this stuff and more. If you like this show, please give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode. See you then.